Welcome back to the show, everybody. It's your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this episode. Back in April, I went out to the National Hurricane Conference as part of the Readiness Lab, that podcast network we're a part of. Man, it was a great experience being their media partner. We interviewed emergency managers from all over the country. We looked at the expo and the new technologies that were coming out of that expo. It's really cool to look at that. But I actually want to pull back the curtain a little bit and talk to one of the organizers of this amazing event that happens every year, or at least back from after COVID. Greg Padgett. He is one of the organizers. Like I said, he's also happens to be a meteorologist, knows a ton about hurricanes and emergency management. It's a great honor for us to have him on the show. Greg, welcome.
Thanks so much, David. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to talk about all things Hurricane Conference and hurricanes really now with the season starting, right now on our doorstep.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about the National Hurricane Conference just real quick before we get into the hurricane season, because we probably have lots of questions from our audience about the hurricane season. Everybody wants to know the predictors. But in terms of the conference, it's truly an emergency management role to coordinate so many different stakeholders, so many things happening. And so from kind of that perspective of coordination, can you give us a kind of a background on what happens behind the scenes to make the conference happen?
Sure thing. We appreciate it. Last year we didn't have the conference as normal, and we didn't have the conference 2 years ago due to COVID. So we were really excited to have it back to full swing, back in normal operation. Last year was a little bit of a hybrid model. We were in June in New Orleans. We typically never do it during hurricane season, only because we're supposed to be good emergency managers and you don't plan when you have to be ready to respond. But we were our hand was forced because of the COVID situation. There was a lull with activity, so we pulled it off. It was a miracle. Had about 1,200 attendees, so really some good numbers
amazing.
there.
Yeah.
But typically we only do it March, April timeframe every year. Traditionally, we've always gone Orlando, New Orleans. Every now and then you may see it in Houston or up along the Atlantic seaboard. We're always open to looking at different places and locations. We do plan about 4 to 5 years out. So you really have to get with us early to say, hey, we want to have it, in our neck of the woods. What's the likelihood? And it comes down to a lot of different parameters as well. Hotel size, convention meeting space. We don't like to have the conference at a hotel and then separately at a convention center nearby. What we have found is that it's difficult to manage that way. You're also losing some of your negotiating power when you're trying to get a venue, because then you have to negotiate with both locations. And so that kind of throws us off. We tried that model, I'd say, it's been about 7 years ago down in Austin, where we did it at the Austin Convention Center. And then we had several hotels involved. And again, losing your marketing capability, you're losing your negotiating capability because you're dealing with so many different properties. So we've gone really with New Orleans and Orlando, back and forth, alternating sites for many years now. And that tends to be the model that works really well. We have a steering planning committee made up of volunteers like myself. It is run by the Tate family. A little bit depressing that we lost David Tate, the leader of the conference last year, unexpectedly, right after the June conference. And of course, this year he was awarded, and his family was awarded the Neil Frank Award, which is the highest honor that we do give for their family's hard efforts and work to bring this conference every year to people who really want to come together to learn about hurricanes and what hurricanes do and how they impact us. This conference started almost 25, 30 years ago after Hurricane Camille impacted the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. And not only along the coast of Mississippi, Camille was one of those hurricanes that had far inland impacts. In fact, massive flash flooding occurred overnight in Virginia from the remnants of Camille. And we saw so many fatalities up in Virginia from that. And so that really did come back to emphasize the need for emergency managers to come together with forecasters, with the National Weather Service, with the National Hurricane Center, with state emergency management, local emergency management, the media, of course, to all come together and really work, in unison to promote the threats of hurricanes and the impacts of hurricanes. Now, I serve on the Media and Public Education Committee as the chair. And then last year, we also introduced for the first time the nonprofit committee, which I also chair. But we have about 6 or 7 different tracks and committee leads. And these are hardworking folks. Again, they all do it volunteer-wise, but they're hardworking throughout the year to help bring in these workshops and these topics and the discussion. Then we meet, annually and plan the conference in the late fall. And then the conference is, produced and happens every year around March or April, usually.
Real quick, we're going to pause for this week's Disaster Tough endorsements. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at L3Harris.com right now. The Readiness Lab is trailblazing disaster readiness. Early access for the highly anticipated course, Emergency Management Response for Dynamic Populations, is currently live. Think you have what it takes? Join us in Atlanta for an immersive experience. Space is limited to 40. Go to thereadinesslab.com/training to learn more. Okay, let's jump back in. Yeah, it's amazing. Talk about the legacy of the Tate family and what they've done. You talked about I would say a smaller year with 1,200. There was certainly, I would say probably more than double that this year for participants. And you think about that. Let's say 1,200, 3,000, whatever it may be. Every year people are coming in. I interviewed mayors of cities who were impacted by Hurricane Ida, who really wanted to understand, hurricanes impact me. What do I need to do as mayors? I interviewed first responders. I interviewed emergency managers for municipalities, emergency managers for organizations. People are looking at this from all different types of perspectives. And it's really fun to think of that legacy of you're pushing the needle forward. You had a catastrophic event, Hurricane Camille. And it's like, okay, like what do we do as an industry now to make sure that we can start reducing the level of impact? And, we were talking a little bit offline about like the hurricane conference really is obviously all about hurricanes, but applies to so many other disasters as well. And so it's a great launching standpoint or starting point for, this idea of mass coordination. You also bring up negotiation from an organizational level. Man, an emergency manager has to be a great project manager and a great negotiator, because you have to always get to the win. And just to even have to show the historical context of what worked for the conference also applies to what might work for you in mitigation, response, recovery, whatever it may be, finding the wins within that to be the most effective in your job. So, great comments there. In terms of the conference moving forward and the participants, I got to interview so many of the participants this year through working with the Readiness Lab and Disaster Tough. As you've interacted with the participants, what are some of the highlights for you that kind of really stand out from like, wow, this is like why this is important to me, especially as a volunteer, that you had to have a lot of passion as a volunteer. So like, what keeps you going there?
No, definitely. I think we know it's almost like a reunion every year because the same people show up to the conference traditionally. It's great to see old friends. It's great to see new people that kind of have that interest. We're beginning to see also a lot of younger emergency managers learn about the conference and show up and wanted to attend. We are an aging industry. White older males have traditionally been at the helm with many emergency management agencies and organizations, and we're really trying to now see a shift in that, which is great because we need to see diversity amongst those who work in emergency management. And so the conference is a great platform for that to start to provide that environment for that to happen and help educate this new and incoming breed of emergency managers. It's really good to also just to engage with different folks from different backgrounds, like you said. I'm a hurricane junkie, so I've always been like just amazed by hurricanes, and that's actually what got me into meteorology. I remember when I was a kid, I was about 9 years old, growing up in East Tennessee, in Knoxville, far, far from the coast, far, far from hurricanes. And I remember Hurricane Allen in 1980. Don't add the math and figure out how old I am, but I remember Hurricane Allen in 1980, and it took up the black and white satellite. Believe it or not, they had black and white back then on the TV, just on the weather part, not the whole TV, just the weather part. It took up the whole Gulf of Mexico when it was right in the center. It was so huge. almost bigger than Katrina. And it was Hurricane Allen headed right towards Texas. And I remember that to this day. And I was just amazed about this storm. It was so perfectly centric, and it had this little white black hole in the middle. And they kept calling it the eye of the storm. I was like, a storm with eyes. I'm 9 years old. And I'm really just amazed by it, and always kind of been interested by it. When I went to the University of Georgia and studied broadcast news, I knew that I wanted to do meteorology. They didn't have a meteorology school there at Georgia at the time. They do now, thankfully, but they didn't back then. So once I got out of Georgia, I decided to become another Bulldog and went to Mississippi State and studied broadcast meteorology. And then since, really have been able to use my broadcast meteorology skills in other jobs and roles as a consultant and doing media consulting and disaster planning consulting. But it really has all come together by my work at the Hurricane Conference. It's very rewarding for me. And to see these people that we see every year helps to kind of bring it back full circle, and to see what people have done in the off year, or seeing those people or hear their stories from those that have had impacts from hurricanes. I know you were in some of the sessions there. We had Margaret Orr, who's a chief meteorologist from New Orleans, and she was one of our awardee recipients as well. And she just talked about how she got into meteorology, and how her impact was from a hurricane. She was actually in the middle of a hurricane, and her dad took her outside, and they looked up at the storm as it was passing over. The eye was passing over, and she could see the stars. And then they had to go back in and take cover as the backside of the hurricane was coming over her neighborhood there where she lived in coastal Louisiana. And that actually just stood with her, and she decided to be a meteorologist, and is still a meteorologist today and doing great work there in Louisiana. So, all of us have been drawn into this profession from one experience or another, or from one event from the other. And I just feel like, we all have lots of stories to tell, and I love to hear people tell stories, even the old timers. There's Bill Massey, who helped develop the hurricane program within FEMA at Region 4, which was where it kind of really culminated and started. And to hear Bill's stories, I love to hear, Neil Frank to come in and talk about, working at the Hurricane Center and all the, the differences that they've seen in the Hurricane Center over the years, and just meet different, really people, stakeholders who are in this field.
You're talking, I think you just identified my next 6 hosts, or my next 6 guests possibly on the show. You're going through. We definitely got to get them on here. It's really fascinating. Listening to the director of NOAA's National Hurricane Center, or I think the National Hurricane Center. And his thoughts, Ken Graham, right?
Yes.
And him talking about that, and talking about words matter, and all this stuff. It's really fascinating to hear from people who've experienced it, and that's certainly my background. I've talked about that quite a bit on this podcast, of being in disasters, and being friends being impacted by disaster, and how that motivation was the start, but now it's something more than motivation. There's a drive there, an unrelenting or unquenchable desire to reduce the impact of disasters for other people. And again, what a great experience. You're talking about the historical makeup of an emergency manager, and I agree with you. The historical makeup of an emergency manager looked like one thing, and I would say that it was a first responder who took a desk job, who thought, I'm going to write a plan and no one's going to look at it. That was like maybe 20, 30 years ago. Pete Gaynor just wrote an amazing article on GovTech and talked about the iterations of emergency management, and he said we're about to enter 3.0. the next phase, or the next iteration of emergency management, and what does that look like? And I agree. Like, the National Hurricane Conference has been phenomenal legacy, but we also need to get the next generation of emergency managers in there, and other like events. I don't want to make this a big promo for this amazing conference, but it does show like the networking opportunities, the learning experiences. One thing that I noted at the conference that I was just blown away by. Now, I will say that all the presenters were amazing. I got to go into virtually every room and to hear them speak as we were going around. And so no discredit to any of their content. But what I thought was really interesting as the participants, there were 2 sessions where there was standing room only. In fact, people were standing outside the room watching, and both happened to be about learning about risk. And I was like, thank goodness, because our industry, in order to get to the next level, needs to understand data and analytics much more. Artificial intelligence, even. Like, we're not using a lot of the tools that our counterparts are using. when I say counterparts, I'm talking about industry and military, first responders, whoever, are trying to get situational awareness. As you, as a meteorologist, as a scientist, as somebody who looks at data and can understand risk, has there been moments of, I wouldn't say frustration, but you're like, we know this information now, and I need my emergency manager counterpart to start understanding this? Is there things that, if I was an emergency manager listening to you right now, I'm like, okay, I need to learn X, Y, and Z. What would you tell them to learn?
If I have frustration, it's really how the public perceives the messaging that we're trying to get out to them when it's dire need, when we have
Mm,
something happening. The time to learn about what to do in a hurricane is not when it's knocking on your door, but to really review that before, like now, as hurricane season is starting, to like review what you need to do in order to be prepared or to respond, or if you had to evacuate. Are you in a flood risk area? What if there's a Cat 3 versus a Cat 5? Would you know the difference in which one you might need to leave for, which one you're okay to stay and hunker down?
mm,
All those different considerations are really important for people who live in hurricane risk areas across this country. But then also, even further inland, like I said, you could be in a flood risk area and there could be a dying hurricane or tropical system moving over your area and cause massive flooding. If you remember that last year, that flooding that occurred just west of Nashville in the middle of the night out of nowhere, and it
mm,
was historic and it was so much rain. We are beginning to see a lot more of these wild weather events that are due to, some say, climate change and climate impacts, because we've not seen it like this before. Remember the remnants of what happened with Ida last year after it made landfall on coastal Louisiana and then moved all the way up into the Northeast, and this horrific flooding in New Jersey and New York, the subwaves. I still
mm.
see that video of that teenager walking in his basement and walks through the basement room. And as soon as he exits the room, it gets to the doorway, the whole wall collapses from all the flooding that was happening around their house
Jeez.
outside. It just was horrific. And just, there were a lot of fatalities up there in the Northeast. A lot of people weren't prepared for it or expected it. We're seeing these storms, they carry a lot more water content. They can hold together longer. They're moving faster. All these different weather related impacts are causing them to be, unfortunately, more impactful across the U.S. and across the Gulf Coast, across the Northeast. But if I had any recommendation for a local emergency manager, they tend to be one or two person departments. Sometimes they are overwhelmed, they have a lot of responsibility, have other responsibilities outside of emergency management even sometimes. But the
That's right.
goal is to, when educating the public or working with the public, there are so many resources out there that they can employ and they can utilize. Definitely, I always recommend every emergency manager have a best friend with the media, a best working relationship with the media. There have been
Mm.
times when those who work in government on the local side or the state side sometimes look at the media as an adversary. Never, ever should that ever be the case. The media is there to help you amplify every single thing that you're doing, which your goal as emergency manager is to educate the public and prepare the public. And the media is there to do that for you. If you have an adverse relationship with the media, change it. Make it better. Find a way to engage with them. Work with them. Invite them to your EOC in the off season.
Mm,
Have them participate in your exercises. Don't let them cover your exercise. Have them be an exercise
mm,
player. Let them go through that whole process of what it's like to respond. That will also make them better at their job on reporting about what you're doing in a storm or a disaster, because sometimes they get it wrong. They're the media. We know that these are people who yesterday they were reporting on a city council meeting and budget constraints, and then today they're covering a hurricane, and so they're supposed to be a hurricane expert or emergency management expert. No, they're not. But that's their job, to communicate. So the more that they can be involved with the local emergency manager and the emergency management system and learn about NIMS and learn about ESFs and learn about how we respond as emergency managers, the better they're going to do their job, the better they're going to be able to communicate with the public.
That's like ironically for media, that's like the mic drop moment. We always try to look for a mic drop moment, and that's definitely it. The I hilariously enough, I'm in media, but I'm not in media. I don't know. I don't consider myself, like, at one point I need to like take off the clown makeup and realize, like, okay, like I'm just lying to myself. The I harp on media quite a bit, but you brought up you brought up actually several issues, but two main issues really stood out for me. Is one, the messaging type, but also like inherently, emergency managers should be working with their counterparts. Media is a counterpart. And I have been a long-term fan, and this is probably championed by a woman named Jackie Chandler, who was PIO for the National Strike Team years ago. And she was like, why isn't media a participant in training? And when she used to say that, I was like, well, but when I thought about it more and more, it's like, they are a huge partner in like everything. You cannot do anything without media, rumor control or otherwise. And I think you just made a really good pitch, which I really haven't heard before, is like, hey, they cover a million different topics. It's really no surprise they're not the expert. But if you're not working closely with them, one, you failed as an emergency manager because that's the job as an emergency manager. But two, you're not helping yourself out either. I will say that the messaging in EM kind of drives me nuts. We use different phrases on our podcast and at our company, really, because we recognize that we need to start attacking the stuff from within. And my listeners, I'm probably saying it at exhaustion for them at this point, but like, we don't use the word preparedness in my company. That's blacklisted. We use the word readiness. Because if I say emergency readiness, that feels interactive. That feels like I'm doing something. When I say emergency preparedness, people think doomsday preppy, which is not. It's the exact same thing what we're trying to convey. It's the same thing with resiliency. I'm a fan of resiliency. That's important, but I don't think that should be king. So we say disaster tough because you want to be strong or you want to be tough in every phase of the disaster. That includes your decision making, the analytics, working with stakeholders, making the tough call. That's important, and being a little more tougher, in yourself, so that you can be, pushing back on that event. The last thing I'm going to call out is what you said earlier when you called yourself a hurricane junkie. That like started to like make me twitch because, like hurricanes produce so much junk. Like, like going out to a catastrophic disaster, it's like it's one thing to be a junkie of like, oh, I really care about this stuff, but like, oh my gosh, there's just so like hurricanes are so complex. And the real problem is, to your note, this is like probably our fourth thing we're calling out now instead of two, is that you're saying it's getting worse, and I agree. I have been to multiple events, whether it's hurricanes or wildfires, you name it, where every year, even multiple times a year, they're breaking the record. And you're like, that's not normal. You're not supposed to break the record every year. And so that's really concerning. And if you can like kind of walk us through that, and I'm going to play devil's advocate for a second, because when I say that, people are like, well, what about the 4 hurricanes in 1 year, 20 years ago? Or what about this? Or what about that? You mentioned Hurricane Camille, Cat 5 hurricane. But like, what's the difference between like, oh, Cat 5 hurricane 30 years ago and like climate change? Can you explain to us climate adaptation for the sake of the listeners?
Well, I think, climate change is impacting how many storms we get, how strong they are, how fast they move, how fast they intensify. That's the humdinger of them all, is rapid intensification. We're seeing so many more hurricanes now rapidly intensify, and a lot of that has to do with sea surface temperatures, has to do with the conditions around these storms. How quickly can they develop? Is there increased rainfall coming off over Africa? And so we're seeing more systems come off the coast, those Cape Verde hurricanes, and work their way all the way across the Atlantic. Or we're seeing also a lot of storms develop right in the Gulf of Mexico really, really quickly. That's what Camille did. Camille was a
Hurricane Harvey, same.
Yeah, and Harvey as well. Quick developing hurricanes that were in the Gulf of Mexico. Ida did the same thing. Ida developed so quickly into a Cat 4, Cat 5 almost at one point, or may have been a Cat 5 before it made landfall. But it happened so quickly they couldn't even go through their whole evacuation process in New Orleans. And so when you have these kind of systems now developing, and with so many people living along the coast, when Camille hit back in '69, the coast of northern Gulf coast of the Mississippi region and all that, was bare compared to the way it is now. A Camille today would be just horrific because there's so much development there and so many people there. But we're seeing these storms, develop so quickly. 2 years ago, 30 named storms, historic number of storms out there. Never had as many, and had to go through all the alphabet storms that we had on the list, and then had to go through, the Greek alphabet and all of that, and cause a little bit of confusion. Not as many last year, but we're still above normal. And then again, now with the season coming up, we're already seeing that the predictions are we're going to have another active year above normal again. And we're seeing these patterns. We do see fluctuations. If you look at hurricanes over many, many years and decades, you see where there's a lull, and then there's increased activity, and then there's a lull. If you remember, though, 1992, first storm of the season, Hurricane Andrew. Another Cat 5 hurricane hit South Florida. Only 7 storms that year. Only 7. Wow, nothing to worry about, right? If they would have told you at the beginning of the season, we're only going to have about 7 storms, whatever, this year, you would have been like, oh, well, let's have a party. Let's go to the coast. We don't have to worry about it. But yet, the big one is Hurricane Andrew, the first one. And again, it was another storm that developed rapidly and just slammed into South Florida. 3 days out, it was a dissipating low pressure area. They'd almost written it off. And then all of a sudden, it just generated and quickly intensified over the Bahamas and just slammed into South Florida. And so hurricanes are so unpredictable when you throw in the element of climate change as well on top of that, and then with all the development and the people along the coast, it's a terrible recipe. Something that you would go over to your aunt's house and have to eat that you hate. It's a terrible recipe that we mixed up together that we're going to have to deal with, take our medicine and swallow it. But we really need to do a better job of educating people, letting people be readiness prepared, get them out of there, let them be able to respond and know what to do.
So again, you brought up, like, we're going to have you back on like weekly or something, because you're bringing up so many good things here. Yeah, when I heard Director Graham say that, the average storm now is 3 days, I had a flashback to a FEMA Region 6 meeting that I attended, where they were talking about their hurricane plan with the state. I won't say which state, but one of the states. And it was 120 hours. They needed 120 hours to start planning for a hurricane from onset. And I was thinking, okay, you're saving 72 hours, almost half, just over half. And that's if you're lucky. They spin up so quickly now, and maybe they always have been, but the frequency, I like how you said, it could be only 5-7 storms. Great. But like, if one of them's Andrew, and that caused devastation across the U.S. That wasn't just in the Gulf. They had major problems all the way up to at least St. Louis and beyond. And, people kind of forget that too, like the flash flooding that it can occur in other locations. And so, we're talking about education, but there has to be something more we can do. I know we can do more, because George Siegel, director of Last House Standing, who's been on the show, he also has a podcast, Tell Us How to Make It Better, talked about building codes and preventing wind damage and all this other stuff that you can do. From a meteorologist perspective, seeing the data again, working with emergency managers, what are some of the things that we can actually do to mitigate threat now? I mean, climate change is happening. Climate adaptation is a thing. What do we actually do to prevent, disasters? But besides telling people don't move to the east or the coast, because they're doing that in groves. Like, we can't stop them from going, right? Like 40% increase, in like the last 40 years? That's insane. Anyways.
And they rebuild. Yeah, as soon as they get impacted by a hurricane, they lose a home, they rebuild it right back. Hopefully they're rebuilding it back stronger and able to withstand, like that last house standing there, after Hurricane Michael near Panama City. But we unfortunately need to see more building codes and stricter building codes, and people taking, mitigation efforts to make their homes better fortified. And they can do that. You may not have had your home built when codes were in place, but there are some things that you can do. And the great place to go to is FLASH, the Federal Alliance of Safe Homes. And they have lots of resources on their website. They're a nonprofit that have worked really to help strengthen that building code process, help be hurricane strong. And they are working with individuals, and communities and states and elected officials and FEMA to help really drive home that need for, what people can do to be better prepared with their with their homes, with being able to withstand hurricanes. That's straps up in the attic on some of the joists. That's making sure that the garage door is strapped in, because once you break that envelope of your home and those winds come in, it's all history after that. You're gonna compromise the structure and the integrity of the home. It's gonna blow up. The roof's gonna come off. You're gonna have debris coming in, or all that heavy wind load coming in, and so you really need to make that envelope of protection around your home. The issue is we have to think about marginalized and underserved communities and people who don't have the resources. We have a lot of food insecurity right now. People trying to worry about getting food on the table. They're not going to go in and retrofit their home before hurricane season.
That's right.
They either don't have the resources, the capability, or they're working 3 or 4 jobs and don't really think that it's going to be an impact to them, or nor do they have the capability to do that. And so it may be an easy fix, $200, but $200 to somebody who's trying to put food on the table is a lot of money. And so we need to have better programs that address those who can't afford to do it themselves. We need to have better, stricter codes, building codes in place in the beginning. So when I build these new homes, that we're being better, at construction capabilities. And they do that in Florida. Florida's obviously learned from all the impacts that it's had. We need to see that more along the eastern seaboard, all the way up into the Northeast. Northeast gets hit by hurricanes. Hello, Hurricane Sandy. Love you. And then you have to think about Gulf Coast as well. Some of those states in the Gulf Coast, where they don't want to be as enforceable with building codes, they still need to do that as well. So, there's a lot there that people can be doing. There's a lot that government can be doing, but we also have to think about those who have some limitations on what they can do.
I'll give a final story to drive home your point, because I 100% agree with you. I've been to enough disasters where disasters don't, I hate to say it like this, but don't really faze me. Like you see horrible things happen to good people, and horrible things happen to sometimes not to great people. But it's like, man, that sucks. That's usually the thought, oh, this really sucks. But one of the most heartbreaking moments of my entire career was in Hurricane Harvey. We were doing field assessments on our model to see if our model was correct, of trying to figure out how many homes were impacted, and picked several communities. And there was one community, I have pictures of it, maybe I can share it sometime, of the school right next to it. But I was confused by the location, so we went out there, and there were about 30 homes, and I won't share the picture of the homes, but I'll share the picture of the school. There's about 30 homes that were on the fence line of a landfill. And I honestly couldn't tell if the disaster made their roof systems and their homes look like that, or if they were like that before the event. And my heart was just breaking, because not only are you in a literally crumbling a house, and then this hurricane comes in, and that fear that must have just caused, knowing that you don't have the resources to evacuate, you can't do anything. You might have kids. And I had interviewed from people from Hurricane Katrina about busting through their roof, and then a 3-year-old rolling off the roof and them not knowing how to swim. They would have left if they could have. And I hate to end it on such a sad note, but hopefully this drives people into okay, we have to do something. I'm going to make one last call out based off of what you said. We keep on trying to come up with innovative solutions, but we're not implementing the solutions we've already come up with. There's a lot of nonprofits out there. There's a lot of organizations out there who can help. The government is trying to help, but we do a terrible job at messaging and or implementing those solutions. Therefore, the most vulnerable of us, and when I say us, I really mean us, right? The most vulnerable of us, we're not helping them as much as we can. And that's not to negate, personal responsibility and effort. However, you can do the best thing you can and still lose, right? And so those are the people we should be helping out. And I don't know, I'm just super passionate about that. So great call out. If you're going to end this episode, you just gave so many ideas, so many solutions for people, maybe thought-provoking ideas for people to think of. Your last advice to emergency managers, what would it be?
To work with all stakeholders in your community. Don't forget about the diverse and marginalized members of your community. They may be the hardest to reach, but they are also the hardest that it will have to recover from an impact in a storm. And so the majority of your community may have insurance. They're going to make it through. They're going to be okay. They'll be able to recover. It's those more diverse members of the community and those that are less fortunate that are going to have the hardest time to recover, if they ever recover at all. So most of your focus and efforts should really be on those most vulnerable in your community. And if you want to learn more about the Hurricane Conference, a quick little plug, it's hurricanemeeting.com to learn about the next Hurricane Conference next year, which will be in New Orleans.
Great call out. Great point. In fact, we'll put in our show notes for the National Hurricane Conference. Again, huge fans. They're so complex. There's either so much junk, or if you're a junkie or you want to become a junkie, I think it's a great conference to be a part of. And yeah, we went out there. It's a media partner, but we wanted to be a part of things that are good for the industry. And when you're talking to hundreds, if not thousands, of emergency managers, having these high-level discussions, talking about new technologies, talking about what we should do next, especially as the climate, both in the industry and in the environment, is changing, it definitely is worth attending. And so I fully promote that. Again, Greg, thanks so much for coming on the show, for talking with me. Great experience. We've been lacking our producer today, but it's been still great to have you on, and thanks for working with us.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right, everybody, if you like this episode, if you're gearing up for the hurricane season, or if you're outside of what you can traditionally call the hurricane belt or that Gulf, and you learned something, we really want to know about it. Tell us in our social comments and social media for the Disaster Tough podcast on whatever platform you used. If you have a question for Greg, ask the community. He can answer, other people can answer. If you have a specific question for him that you don't want to ask the community, I implore you to ask the community, because there's a whole bunch of people out here who are hurricane junkies like Greg. But if you need to ask him a specific question, whether it's about the National Hurricane Conference or you need more information, you can contact us at contact@thereadinesslab.com, and we'll make sure that he sees it and gets back to you. Otherwise, make sure you like and subscribe to this episode, and we'll see you next week.